Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. In this episode, I'm talking to Agrii's senior agronomist, Andrew Richards. Today's topic is boosting bugs in soils and asking an expert from Agrii, what does this mean? What is the agronomic benefit? And of course, importantly, is there a financial benefit for the grower? So Andrew, can we start by asking, what are the bugs in our soils that we should be aware of?
Well, Tony, that's I think what we've seen over the last few years is this massive change in our understanding of what is in the soil, and obviously, as a result of coronavirus, we've all become suddenly experts in PCR testing, understanding of the genetics makeup of microbes, which is what's been used by soil biologists or microbiologists with increasing levels of sophistication over the last 10 years to really start to understand what's in the soil. Now, I think before we perhaps delve a little bit into that, it's worth getting our heads around what is the scale of what we're looking at within the soil. And I think, we can start off with the food web, where we've got these different trophic levels, we call them. So we're starting off with the plants, with the plant roots and the exudates and the decaying plant material. Then we've got our decomposers, those the bacteria and the fungi involved with that. Then we have the shredders, the little creepy crawlers. Then we have the predators, those that feed on the microbes. And then we've got this ecosystem engineers, the worms. Now, in terms of trying to get this scale of things, so if we think down at that the lowest level at our decomposers, so there's something like 100,000 maybe bacteria and different fungal species within a spadeful of soil. And this could represent something like a billion, several billions of individual organisms. Then at the next stage up, there's the little animals that feed on them, the nematodes and protozoa, and we're talking hundreds of species and 10 to 100,000 individuals within a soil sample. Then we're looking at the microarthropods, the insects, the arachnids, the mollusks, and we're looking at hundreds of species, so maybe 5,000. And then you've obviously got the some mammals that are across the top of that, so living on some of those worms and beetles. So it's a really massive environment. And I think this get some idea of the scale. You could be within a gram of soil. One scientist has estimated there's 10 billion living bacteria within that.
Right. So, how do you assess, how do you measure actually how healthy your soil is from this perspective in terms of bugs?
Well, that's what I think is not a practicality part at the moment, which is why people have gone to looking at indicators. So you remember I talked about the trophic level. So we start off at the smallest level with the bacteria and fungi, where we're dealing with tens of thousands of species. So at that point at the moment, where some people will say, well, an indication of total microbial biomass is a good idea. But the problem is you don't know what's good and what's bad. So is that reflector of healthy? Then we could move up a notch. And this is one that's favoured by a number of academics, is looking at different types of nematode. Now, from an agricultural point of view, we always think of nematodes as being, pests, don't we, like PCN. Whereas the free-living nematodes are a really critical part of this whole soil ecosystem and its functionality. And within the soil, you have nematodes that live on bacteria, some that live on fungi, some that are herbivores. And they have different mouth parts. And one of the ways of determining what your makeup of bacteria and fungi is within looking at those relative populations. Now, we were part of an EU-funded project, AgriCycle, and we had a PhD student, Anna, working up at Harper, and she looked at nematodes, and really quite useful method. But at the moment, it's completely impractical to take beyond the lab, because what she was doing and had to be trained up to do this, was looking down a microscope at the mouth parts of nematodes and determining which were which. So you can imagine the time-consuming nature of that just to get to understanding one soil sample. Obviously, in time, we're looking at a genetic way of doing that, which will hopefully come along. At the next scale up, again, because it's all around this sort of hierarchy, you can know that the variation of microarthropods and insects can be then used because as an indication, because obviously they depend on what's below them in terms of nematodes, protozoa, bacteria. And there's an international standard of looking at springtails, and you look at the relative population of those that live below and above ground. And again, that's a question of identification, but it's not perhaps quite as difficult because the springtails that live below ground don't have pigments because they don't need to protect themselves from the sun, so they're clear, and the ones that live above ground are pigmented. And again, there's some sort of, although it sounds a bit far-fetched, there's some quite good correlation between how those relative numbers vary and soil health that's documented and been produced in peer-produced papers. And then above that, this is the one area that if you had 20 of soil scientists in a room and all saying, how do you measure soil health? Simply earthworms. And that's a relative number of earthworms. And that, I suspect, is going to be within the ELMS program we see, one of the initial measurements of soil health, because it's something that people can agree on. And also because I think farmers, and inherently gardeners and everybody relates to, don't you? See a nice lot of earthworms, healthy soil. And it is a good indication, but obviously it's not giving anything like the complete story.
No, but it does give us all a means with which to watch our soil health, doesn't it? As you said, we can all relate to that. So that sounds absolutely fascinating. I can really sense the depth of science behind this. I really can. From the farmer and the agronomist perspective, how does this impact on plant health?
Well, I think it's something we've tended to, largely ignore. But I mean, there are some really sort of interesting sort of basic cases that, have been around for years. And I think the simple one, and I think this is also one we need to really get our head around, is what really controls that sort of biodiversity in the soil, the sort of fungi, bacteria, and really most soil mechanisms is pH. Now that is a sort of have far bigger impact than anything else. And sometimes we can use pH to, manipulate soil health. And people have done it for years without perhaps thinking about it or understanding the sort of biology behind it. So, for example, earthworms like neutral to alkali soils, and around pH 7 would be optimum for an earthworm. Now, if you wanted to grow potatoes in that field and you had your slightly above pH 7, you're going to have an increased risk of scab. So a lot of potato farmers, for a healthier soil, they actually, having less scab is more important than earthworms. And this is where that sort of play off. And then we've also known for many years around clubroot, and that whether it's the sort of Brussels sprout grass or sort of migrated onto the sort of calcareous soils, or growing Swedes in Scotland, that high pH suppresses clubroot. So we're already that sort of very basic level of manipulation of soil biology to help us with plant health.
Sure. So you've mentioned the pH, and a lot of talk on the street at the moment, if you like, or even in the field, is about organic matter and regen agriculture. So tell me a little bit about organic matter. How influential is that in terms of soil health?
Well, I think along with pH, organic matter is absolutely critical. And in a previous podcast, you've talked to Andy Neal. And I think for anybody who hasn't listened to Andy Neal in terms of understanding of organic matter, how that drives soil structure, soil functionality, please do listen to that and his understanding of sort of pores and structure. And that is really is sort of that vital, because organic matter provides the food, the habitat, sort of substrate to enable biology to exist within the soil.
Yeah, very interesting. And a great point that you made there, which is do listen to Andy Neal's podcast, which is all about understanding the science of soil organic matter. Well worth a listen to if you haven't already done so. Something that I've read that you've written about is biologicals and fixation, nitrogen. What's the influence of bugs when it comes to that?
Well, we know that improving nitrogen use efficiency is going to be critical component going forward. We've got the FAO guidelines coming out in 2030, or I think, I'm not quite sure how mandatory that is, that nitrogen use efficiency has got to be increased, nitrogen losses reduced by 50%, which is going to really sort of focus the mind on how we improve our use of nitrogen. And this year we've had this really massive sort of kick in the teeth for agriculture in terms of nitrogen. Haber-Bosch we've relied on. We've seen nitrogen shoot up from 270 pounds a tonne to 695 pounds a tonne, completely changing the dynamics. And how do we make nitrogen work in a better way? So for quite a few years, the sort of holy grail in the way of soil biology is, can we get soil biology to fix nitrogen for us for the non-leguminous plants? We're obviously all very familiar with peas and beans, where we don't need to apply nitrogen, and the rhizobial bacteria, which enable them to fix their own nitrogen. So the question is, can that then be looked at in other crops? And there's a lot of work around the world looking at whether it's sort of cereals, wheat, rice, maize, the world's major cereal crops. And can we, they don't normally associate with rhizobia, but can we find a situation where adding biology to the soil, you could enable them to gain a level of nitrogen? Now, we've had a history within Agrii of looking at a number of projects. I know Colin Lloyd and team were involved with the European project when the Dalgety business joined Mastoc. And we've since worked with a number of other provisos of bacteria. But what's perhaps becoming increasingly known as this level of biology understands within soil, that it's not about single or limited number of adding a few nitrogen fixing bacteria to the soil is going to make the difference. The whole sort of complexity of those trophic levels I talked about, how they interrelate. So you might have introduced some soil fixing bacteria into the soil, but are they able to survive in that soil? Is it the right pH? Can they colonize, etc.? Some of the first points. Secondly, they could produce a lot of nitrogen, which just feeds something else within the food web. And particularly, this is seen from work done on releasing a phosphate, again using bacteria, that you will reach a point where you don't actually get phosphate available to the plant, but you actually introduce some phosphate, some of the bacterial feeding nematodes at the right level, and you cause much more cycling of the bacterial population, and suddenly you start to get phosphate available to the plant. And there's these sort of complex interactions that are going on, and just sorry to drift from one to the other, but you see within nitrogen, you've also got the importance of earthworms within the process. You've got nematodes, again, as part of that, getting nitrogen from being fixed by the bacteria into the plant. And this is where actually I think that there's some really exciting work going on, rather than thinking we're being clever here, we're adding biology to the soil. Well, we've got so much biology in the soil, is how do we manage that soil in a way that is sustainable, but actually encourage the soil to enhance the biological activities that we'd like to.
Very interesting, Andrew. And moving on, how can having a good soil health help us with regards to elms?
Well, there is going to be a payment for managing soils in a healthier way. And there's definitely, or for monitoring that health. Now, like with all things, there's massive, to do with government committees and the fact we haven't got not single definition of soil health, discussion around what might be included within that. But there's definitely going to be a component. To start with, it looks as though it will be around looking at VES, which is visual valuation of soil, a technique developed in New Zealand by Graham Shepherd and perhaps all taken on in the UK by Struck. And that's freely widely available, but it does a bit of time consuming looking at structure in the field. The biological components will be around monitoring soil organic matter and earthworm tests. Going beyond that will be the sort of next phase, what might be for soil health. But I think that's where that will be. Now, whether it's all getting slightly sort of muddied by wanting then to link soil organic matter with carbon. And if people are wanting to understand the carbon stocks they've got within the soil, what is the international requirements in terms of depth? Obviously, the more deeper you take the sample, you've got carbon running down through the soil, the more carbon you can claim within the soil that you've got and maybe get a payment for it. So it's a bit sort of complex. And as usual with all these things, slightly muddied. And I think we need to be a bit cautious or jumping into some of the carbon schemes. But definitely organic matter, worms and VES will play a part within that. And then as hopefully the science becomes agreed, perhaps a more comprehensive and sort of functional based approach to some other measurements will be incorporated.
Sure. So what I'm hearing is that this is an area where agronomists and growers need to really, really keep a watchful eye because it's going to be in their interest to do so. Bringing it together, what's Agrii doing? Are you doing any trials or research yourselves?
Well, one of the key things that we're doing is launching within Agrii our own soil health service offer, because people are requesting whether it's around understanding their carbon stocks, whether it's around meeting SFI requirements to enable them to have a baseline of the soil health status. But I say it's one of those things that's sort of difficult. You look at it from a scientific point of view, and there's so much out there and so much unknowns. Where do you go? So it's homing down to what we can sensibly do now that is going to give farmers a really good benchmark as to where their soils are and will be relevant going forward, rather than we're measuring things that will be proved, well, that's a bit irrelevant in 2 or 3 years' time. And that's been one of the challenges of getting together this service. But this is going to be launched after Christmas. And, we put a lot of work into it the last 2 or 3 years in trying to get the best approach to measuring soil that's going to have that functionality and help to the farmer in terms of helping him improve his soil management and nutrient use efficiency and keep his soils in the healthiest state.
That service sounds absolutely fantastic, Andrew. What one key message would you leave our listeners with today?
I think one of the things that I think is less is more with so much to do with soil. And I think the one thing over the years, we've got to do less cultivation. We need to get our soils in a state where that natural structure is enabled and function to work. And that consistent structure creates the habitats. We then keep oxidizing off the organic matter. We've got the pores. We've got a place for that biology to work and enable us to get the most out of our soils.
Okay, well, thank you, Andrew, for sharing some of the science behind how we can bring our soils to life. And it's clear that there is an agronomic benefit, which of course means a financial benefit for our growers. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. The Tramlines podcast has now received over 2,500 downloads, and we want to make sure this podcast is relevant to your farm business. And so if you have any questions that you would like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.